So, hello everybody. Welcome back to the Menshik Club and welcome to the next installment of Teaching Tuesday. Today I'm going to be talking about the next topic, which is checkmating a lone king with only a king and rook. Last week we covered the queen and king versus the lone king, if you remember. If not, you can consult the earlier video. So again, how I like to do this is I like to start off by just showing what it is that we're aiming for when we are confronted with a position where we have an extra rook and our opponent just has a king. Obviously, we're trying to checkmate our opponent's king. And in order to do that, it's rather like the instance of king and queen versus king, where we have to drive the lone king into the corner or onto the edge of the board in order to achieve checkmate. King and rook is a little bit different and a little bit harder because we can't achieve this without using our own king to help the rook out. That's because the rook is a weaker piece than the queen is. So if you remember with the queen, we could just drive the king into the corner just using the queen, then bring our king up at leisure and deliver checkmate. Being careful, of course, not to stalemate our opponent. With the king and rook, we do have to use our king to help the rook out, to protect it sometimes. But before we get to that, this is the type of position that we're aiming for. In this position, the king is already driven into the corner, and in order to deliver mate, all we have to do is move the rook to the 8th rank. You see that we are checking the king. We're attacking it with our rook. And you see how the king helps out in that endeavor because now the opposing king does not have any of those escape squares. In this case, on A7 and B7. So that our king helps to close off the escape squares. Also, you'll notice that the rook controls the B8 square as well as checking the king on the A8 square. So again, that is a checkmate. So this is the type of thing that we're aiming for. Here's another instance. You notice that it doesn't have to take place in the corner per se. It can also be on the edge of the board. And in this case, we're going to take our rook, put it back on A1. You notice that the rook is checking the king sitting on F1. And meanwhile, the black king is stopping the white king from escaping to any of those 3 squares. At the same time, the black rook is also covering both of these squares. So there is no escape, and that is a checkmate. These are the 2 basic positions that we can achieve. There's no other way to deliver a checkmate. And you notice that this actually looks exactly like the hallway checkmate that we described with the queen. But it's just a rook doing the checking instead of the queen. So the next position I want to show you is a really crucial thing that you're going to need to know when you are driving a king into the corner or onto the edge of the board. In this position, black is to move, and you will note that the rook can't just go there. In other words, we can't play rook to C8 and try to deliver checkmate because the king just captures the rook, and that's a draw. Okay, so why am I showing you this position? Well, let's just say that black says, okay, I want to move my rook farther away from the king so I can deliver mate. So let's say I play rook over to H4, and I'm counting on my opponent playing king here so that I can just do the hallway mate. The problem with this strategy is that they can delay the mate by moving king to C8, and seemingly possibly escaping, although it's not really escaping. You're still winning, but you're actually just losing time by doing this. So let's go back to the original position. What you have to know here is that as black, you don't have to do anything. You can sort of just pass the move to white. Because if you think about it, if white were on the move, they wouldn't be able to move their king there, 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 or there. They would only be able to go into the corner, and then actually our move rook to c8 that we were thinking about in the first place would work. So it turns out all we have to do is just sit and wait and play something like rook to c3. Actually, it doesn't matter where you move the rook as long as you don't move it to c8, like we said in the first place. We don't want to move it there. But almost anywhere else on that file works just fine. We've just passed the move to white. They're forced to play king to c8, or a8, sorry, and then we just mate them with rook to c8. So this can be kind of hard to understand because once again, we're sort of like conditioned to think that we need to do something with every move, something active. But in fact, sometimes we can just pass the move to our opponent and then they have to mess their position up. So actually, if you look at the first line we looked at with rook to h4, and actually not king to a8, but king to c8, we said that we might be able to escape here. Here we can play another waiting move. After king to c8, we can just play rook to d4. And this cuts the king off. Forces it to move to b8. And then we get enough checking distance. We can go rook to d8. This is another hallway mate. You notice all the squares are covered either by my king or by my rook. Okay? So the question is, how do I actually get someone's king to be on the edge? Because chances are when you start off, when you first achieve this material balance of rook and king versus king, the king is going to be more free to roam around, and you're going to have to figure out how to basically drive it into the kind of position that we've just looked at. So we're actually going to use a variation of the shrinking the box technique that we learned with the queen. The same thing applies to the rook, but you just have to use your own king in conjunction with the rook. So we're going to look at how this is achieved. So in this position, black is to move. Black is obviously the one with the stronger material and is trying to checkmate the white king. But the white king, you'll notice, is in the center. It's got all 8 possible squares. It can choose to go in pretty much any direction it wants. So we have to restrict its freedom. So a good way to start is with rook to d1. This cuts the king off and basically denies it the left-hand side of the board. Now again, I'm going to say the same thing I said with the queen. This is not the only way to achieve mate, what I'm about to show you. There are many ways to do this. You could, for instance, also start off with a move like rook to b4. Let's just do that. And that's going to cut off the whole lower half of the board. So there is not only one way to do this, but this is just a general technique that'll help you to drive the king into a corner. So usually in these positions, if I'm playing on as white, if I'm not resigning, I'm going to try to move the king closer and harass the rook with attacks. This is why we need our king in order to protect the rook. So I'm going to move my king up closer, king to e3. And now as black, I could play a move like king to c2. I could also play king to c3. Either one is fine. So let's say that white moves king to e2, sort of like menacing the rook, maybe hoping I'm going to move my king away and unprotect it, which of course I'm not going to do. There's actually a really, really effective move here as black, and that is rook to d3. Why is this so effective? Because the box in which the white king lives has just been shrunk. It's been shrunk to exactly 8 squares on 2 ranks, whereas before it had the freedom of basically moving around almost the whole board, or half the board after the first move that I made. So this would actually be a really bad way for white to play if they're trying to defend, because now they're only confined to 2 ranks. They don't want this. So after king to c2, they play king to e4. We still play rook to d3. This technique of shrinking the box in this way by moving the rook where it's protected by the king and attacked by our opponent's king is shrinking the box now. So the box has now shrunk to basically this 5x4 area, whereas before the white king had the entire left-hand side of the board. Okay. And we just repeat this whole process. So after rook to d3, white plays king to e5, and we just move our king closer. So we attack the king again if we're the defending side, and again we move the king closer. Now I want you to notice something. It's tempting to check here. It doesn't really achieve a whole lot. But basically just moving our king closer is the way to go. So after king e5, now we go rook d4. And now you see that, I can get my arrows to work. We're now in a 4x4 box. We were in a 5x4 box before, now it's 4x4. So actually, let's choose to move king to e6. And we now go rook to d5. Now we're in a 3x4 box. It's very important that this king stay protecting the rook. Very, very important. Absolutely essential. So after king f6, we now move the king a little closer, king to d4, because our aim is to eventually play maybe rook to e5. Okay. After king e6, we don't want to play rook e5 here, okay, because if we do, the king goes this way. They're not going to cooperate and go that way, and box them into a smaller box. This is actually like a 3x4 box that it's in now, so we haven't really improved matters. So we don't want to play rook e5 check. We want to play the move king to e4. So after king e6, king e4. Now the king is forced to give ground. So king f6. Oh. Sorry, Lichess went a little crazy there. King f6. I do not know what's going on. Rook e5. So after rook e5, now the king is boxed into basically this tiny little box. So as the defending side, remember, I'm trying to run as far away from the edge of the board as I possibly can get. But it's getting harder to do that because the box is getting smaller. So again, white has to give ground. And after king to g6, we can simply play rook to f5. Now notice the king is running out of air because we're now in a 2x3 box. Once it starts to happen, it kind of accelerates, as you can see. So after king to g7, king to e5, king to g6, king to e6, king to g7, and can you guess what we're going to play now? That's right, rook to f6. Now the king is confined to a 2x2 box, and that means that on the very next move it must go to the edge of the board. And in fact, it's now mate in, I think, as little as 2 moves. So if king to h7, then we get king to f7. And now we get that same position we saw before with the waiting move, except we don't have to make a waiting move. So white is to move, and after king to h8, you all see the mate. I'm letting you pause the video if you want to. And of course it's rook to h6. So in this position, a slightly better defense for black, or for white, sorry, is king to g8. That doesn't allow mate in 2. But it still allows mate to happen pretty quickly. Rook f7, king h8, king f6, king g8, and now we just play king to g6, and again white is forced into the corner. King h8, rook f8 mate. So once again, the technique is basically protecting our rook with our king and slowly shrinking the box that the white king is confined to until it finally has to move onto the edge or into the corner, and delivering mate, sometimes with a waiting move, but sometimes like this we can just sort of do it more directly. Let's look at another example. Here's an example where our king, as the stronger side, is actually the one on the edge, and the opponent's king is a little more active. It doesn't get that much harder here because the same principles are going to apply. So I'm going to let you think of a move for white. There is no one right move. There's just basically a process that we follow. If you think of it as like if you started out with a really messy room and you wanted to clean it up, you could start almost anywhere, but you just would follow a certain process. Maybe separating things into piles or something like that. This is kind of like that. There isn't just one way to do it. So don't feel too much pressure. You just have to remember that you try to slowly shrink the area in which the weaker side's king can move. So we're going to start with rook to b4, and that is going to deny the black king anything past this rank, and this rank actually. And you notice that it already can't move to any of these squares, so it has to move left or right. For the sake of argument, let's just say that it goes king to d3. Sorry about that. Lichess sometimes gets a little too speedy. So king to d3. And we are going to go king to f2, king to c3. So now our rook is attacked. That's annoying, but it's not that big a deal. We can just move it somewhere safer, rook to e4. We get attacked again, and now we go king to f3 and protect our rook. So now, in just a few moves, we've confined the black king to a 3x4 box. And we know that that's pretty close to being checkmated. We just have to shrink the box gradually. So actually, let's try the move king to c3. That's a little bit better than king to d2, because of king to d2 we would do what? We would play rook to e3 and shrink the box to a 2x4 box. So after king to f3, King to c3 is a little bit better defense for black. It holds out a little longer. King to e2. So we've just shrunk the box a little bit more because our king is actually helping to cut off squares. Rook is controlling that, and the king is controlling these two squares. Actually, in this one too. So black is forced to give some ground here. King to b3 is a possible move, and king to d2. We're pretty close to finishing black off here. King to b2. And now we normally don't want to check just willy-nilly in these endings because oftentimes it doesn't do anything. But in this case, since the king has already cut off these three squares, checking on b4 is a great move because it actually drives the king onto the A file, therefore to the edge of the board. So king to a3. We don't move our rook, we just protect it. King to a2, king to c2, king to a3. Now this is one of those positions that we looked at in the beginning where a waiting move is helpful. You can see that if the king were on a2, the black king that is, we're on a2, we would just swing our rook over and it would be a hallway checkmate. But right now the king is attacking the rook. All we have to do in this case is just move the rook some distance away. It doesn't have to be all the way to h4, but we're controlling this square with our rook. We're controlling these squares with the king. And that leaves black only this move, and therefore rook to a4 is checkmate. Okay. Now I want to just mention a couple of pitfalls. What can go wrong? How can you actually throw the win away? One way is you could lose your rook, which is, you never want to do that. If the opposing king is in contact with your rook, you want to make sure your rook is protected by your king. Most people will not allow that to happen. But what can happen actually is that you can, like the queen, you can actually end up stalemating your opponent's king. That can only happen if the king is in the corner. So here's one way that it could happen. You could say to yourself, oh, you know, the king is in the corner. I want to cut it off even more and play a move like rook to g8. That's terrible because the black king has no squares to move to, but it isn't in check. So we know that's a stalemate. That would actually throw away the win and give our opponent a draw. We don't want that. We want to win. Here's another type of position where this could happen. You've driven the king into the corner, and you think, oh, let me just shrink the box to a 1-by-1 box. That's a bad thing, because after rook to g2, we see that white's king is just stalemated because the rook is protected, and the rook is cutting off these two squares of g1 and h2. Actually, in the original position, what we really want to do is just play king to f2, because now the king will have a square to move to, only one, mind you, h2, and then we just mate. So there we are. Hope you enjoyed that. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out in the comments section. And I would urge you to set this up on Lichess analysis board if you can, and just practice, or practice with a friend, or practice with your computer at home. It takes a little bit of practicing in order to get this technique down, but once you get it down, it's very automatic. You don't even have to think about it really. So anyway, hope that was helpful, and I will see you next time.